I'm a big believer in second chances, even for people who commit serious crimes. Who deserves a second chance? Who gets one? And who decides? I'm Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host of Just Justice. I'm a former public defender, a professor of justice studies, and an award-winning author. And I'm excited for us to find new ways to put justice back into our criminal legal system. Hello, and welcome to Just Justice. My name is Jessica Henry, and I'll be your host. Today, we have the pleasure of talking with Dina Windle. Dina is the Chief of Investigators at the New Jersey Office of the Public Defender. She is also a crime survivor and a board member of the Journey of Hope, a nonprofit organization led by family members of murder victims that work to end the death penalty and call for more constructive responses to violent crime. Dina, thank you so much for coming on the show.
I am just so excited to be here, and I thank you for the invite.
Before we get started, listeners should be warned that this podcast will include discussions of sexual assault and violence, and it may not be appropriate for everyone listening. Okay, Dina, so why don't we start at the beginning of your journey in November 1994? Gosh, what is that, 30 years now?
Oh,
I think I did the math right? So November 1994, and you were a law student in Little Rock, Arkansas, and something unthinkable, something terrible happened. Would you mind sharing the story of what happened to you that day?
I wouldn't mind at all. I just want to give you a precursor that it's still so emotional for me.
Yeah, of course.
So you're going to hear me pause and maybe weep a little. And I don't make apologies for it because it's a lot that has put my life where it is today. So I have no embarrassment of it. It's just, again, you're reliving something that my friends and I always say. It's like, you can't remember what you had for lunch last week, but you can always remember this unbelievable event that it's not a norm for everyone.
Yeah, and don't ever feel anything but pride in your experience and being able to share it with us. And we're so grateful. And we're right here with you.
Thank you. That means a lot. So as you were saying, it was my second year of law school in a city that I had never been. I was taking night classes because I couldn't afford full-time daytime. I had to work during the full-time daytime. So it was at night. It was a nice neighborhood. There was nothing in the evening that was unusual about it. And nothing really scared me. I was the oldest one in my family who was very independent and would just get up and leave and tell my mom maybe a day later that I had moved the state or something. So it was not uncommon that I had told my mom I'm moving to another city within the city. So I had been living in this city, North Little Rock, for approximately 2 months. I didn't know nothing about it. I was living with a roommate who I did not even know. I just answered an ad, and that's what you did in those days. You just answered an ad. And there was no internet. We had no cell phones. So I'm just giving you a baseline here. When I tell you the story, you're going to say, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Because we didn't have the technology at the time. So what had happened is I had pulled up at home, and it was a little before 10 o'clock at night. It was constitutional law night and federal taxation night. Again, you remember these strange details. There are a lot of books for both, as any law student knows. They're very heavy. And taxation, you had to get the code beside the book. So very heavy. Constitutional law, very heavy. And I remember having it in a backpack and also in my hand. I had lived in this house, as I said, I was sharing with a friend, and it was on a hill. And she left earlier than I did in the morning. And I really didn't want to get up in the morning. So I parked on the street, and she parked up into the driveway. So I parked as normally did, got out of the car. And then there was this other car that pulled up next to me. Again, no warning senses. And this is something that's not imaginable that you think is going to happen. There was a man who pulled up in his vehicle, and he got out of his car, but didn't leave the door, but just kind of popped his head up and said, hey, I'm looking for these apartments. Can you help me? And I didn't know anywhere, but I knew these apartments because I passed them every single day on my way to get to work. So I was like, oh yeah, I can help you out. And as I gave him directions, he seemed like he didn't really know what I was saying, or it seemed confusing. So I repeated them again to him, and he's like, okay, I got you. And so as I thought he was leaving, I picked up my bag and shut the door and went to walk up the driveway. And I got a sense of kind of dread, like something was going to happen that was going to change my life, basically. And I had that urge inside of me to run. But then I realized I had all these books and they were so heavy and I was going uphill. so that I dropped everything. And then as I began to run, I felt this arm come around my neck and a sharp object in my back. And to this day, I don't know if it was a knife or a gun. And the man who had been giving directions said, "Don't scream. You're coming with me. Take your books." And at that time, it's like a bad horror movie. I screamed and it sounded so loud, but obviously no one heard it. And it was a neighborhood that all the houses were close together. No one heard it. And so he pulled me to his car. And I remember being pushed into the driver's side seat, not the passenger side seat. So he pushed me in. It was a 2-bucket seat. And I still remember what it looked like. And there was one seat in the back that was just one plain seat. It wasn't a separate seat. It was one of these sports cars. And he was driving away and he was very calm. And he was saying, when we're done, we're going to come back and I'm going to drop you off right here. And just, in my mind, I was trying to rationalize it, saying, this guy's just lost. And when he finds out where he wants to be, he's just going to drive me back and then go back. There was no panic. There was just this realization that this man was a little off and there was something wrong, but not alarmed yet. And so as we drove away and we were driving away from the area, I realized he wasn't going to the apartments that said he wanted to go. He was going somewhere else. And it was behind like a strip mall. The mall had been closed for a while now. 10 o'clock was their time and it was past 10. So there was no one around. And so when we went behind him, and I realized at that point that I was in trouble as we were going behind this. And I was trying to figure out, well, maybe I can jump out of the car. Maybe I'd break an arm or whatever, but I'd be away from this person. And as I was trying to do that, out of nowhere, he says to me, "Don't try to get out of that door because it's broken and you won't be able to. And if you attempt to do that, I'm going to stab you to death." It was just matter of fact. And as he said that, I happened to look over and you could tell that there was something wrong with the door, that it wasn't lined up right. And I believed what he was going to say, not out of fear, but it just made sense to me that the door wasn't right. And also, if I'm going to try to get out, it's not worth it for me being killed. I needed to get out alive. And so I figured, well, something else would happen. An opportune time would come up. And it didn't at that time. And so we went behind a shopping mall and he just said, "Take off your clothes." And at that moment, I said to him, "I'm not going to do that." And then he slapped me across my face. And I wore glasses at the time and my glasses flew off the face. And I said to him, and it wasn't true, it was for distance, but I said, "I can't see without those glasses." And he said, "Well, then keep them off." And then he demanded I take off my clothes. And I knew he had a knife or a gun because I had felt it. I hadn't seen it, but he could have stuck it underneath the seat. And we were in this confined spot. And I knew that if I had not done what he asked me to do, that I was going to die. And so we went in the back seat and he raped me in the back seat. And I remember talking to myself and just telling myself I was going to be okay. And kind of feeling like my body was levitating. And I was kind of looking down upon myself, not seeing what was happening, but kind of almost in a comfort way that something was protecting me, saying, "You're going to be okay. Just keep your thoughts, keep your wits about you, and you'd be okay." So after that, he drove away and I put my clothes back on and we went to these ATMs and I had, of course, my pocketbook with me at the time, because it was coming home from school and work. And he told me to get my bank card out. And he went to an ATM machine and wanted to know my number. And at that time, I was so poor. I think I had $100 to my name. And he said, "Well, I'm going to take out $100. Give me your PIN number." And we did all that. We went through several machines until after $100, there was nothing left. And I said, "There's nothing left." And he said, "Okay." So then as we drove away and I realized we were getting further and further away, than I had in my head. And I knew at the time, the further you got away from the place that you were kidnapped was the less likely that you would come back alive. That's all it kept on going through my head, as well as the funny thing now that I look back on it, my mother saying to me, "You can't get killed or else I will kill you for not coming back home," which is just so silly, So I'm thinking my mom won't want me dead. So I really need to somehow figure out how to do this or stay calm and survive. So what I did was I looked around and tried to figure out, okay, we took a left here. Okay, 2 streets and then took a right. So I had tried to figure out where I was going without knowing the streets to have something to do, but also when he was caught to be able to tell the police where we went, because I knew that there were other kids, women on my street, girls, that he could come back and easily get because it was so easy to get me. There was nothing scary about him. And so I knew that with all this information, I could somehow help them down the line because I was convinced I was going to stay alive. So at one point he said, well, I can either keep you outside or I can bring you somewhere warm inside. My thinking was that, well, if he brought me outside and he killed me outside, then my body would decompose at a really rapid rate because the elements would get to me, animals would get to me, something like that. But if I was taken somewhere inside, quote unquote, warm, then my body would not, and it would stay intact for a long time. This is what goes in your head.
Wow. I mean, the fact that you were thinking so carefully and deliberately and strategically under these circumstances is unbelievable.
I think that goes to being a law student. And there are details that you have to remember, details that are important. And so that's what I had been trained like. So this is where my head was like. And you have to understand that I was an intern for the public defenders, and this is 2 years in. So details. So as we go to this house, it's abandoned. And there are other houses around it that seem to be, some more abandoned and some look like they were occupied with lights on in the houses. And at this point, he remembered that I told him that I couldn't see without my glasses, and I pretended I couldn't see him because, again, if I was going to remember this, I was going to remember what this man looked like. And at this point, he didn't believe that I could see because I didn't have my glasses. So he pulls me out of the car, again, out of the driver's side door, not the passenger side door. And I pretended to trip a couple of times saying, I can't see. And he had to grab me. He was upset because he had to grab me because I couldn't see. So now it was like a liability. So he brings me into this abandoned house and sticks me in this closet. I'm 4'11", maybe 95 pounds at that time. And the closet, I kid you not, was tiny. I could probably reach to the top of it. And then lengthwise, I could sit down and my feet could touch one end to the other. And he puts me in there and he ties my hands and he ties my feet. And he says to me, the last thing he says is that I'm coming back for you. And he shuts the door and I can hear this banging on the door as if like this wood that's being banged against it. So I can't get out. And so then he leaves. And he had a bad muffler. It was broken at the time. So I could hear it. And that's another detail I remember. And he takes off and you can hear bad mufflers as they leave. They get lighter, they're really loud. And so he leaves. And then inside the closet, I'm thinking, I'm not going to be here when you come back because I know he's coming back because he hasn't finished me off. And then I thought irrationally, well, if he's a rapist, then he must hang around with rapists. And so then I'm going to get like more rapists to come and do away with me. So again, this is the rationalization that you have in your head. And so I slammed my body against this door about 3 times. It wouldn't open. And I kept on doing it and I was getting tired. And finally, I hit my body for probably the last time. And the door just completely opens up. The wood that was there, that was hammered in, gives way. And I'm on the floor and I'm untying myself. And I'm thinking, how long has it been? Because the sense of time completely skews your mind at this time where you think it's been 3 hours and it hasn't. And so I'm on my hands and knees because I figure that people can see in the windows. And again, my weird rationale is like, if he's next door, he's going to see me and he's going to come back and kill me. So I can't stand up. I can't let people know that I'm in this house. So I'm crawling around trying to figure out how to get out of this place without being seen. And I actually laughed at myself because the way that we came in, unbeknownst at that time, there was no door. And of course, I'm going out the same way and I'm just cracking myself up, kind of like crying, laughing, saying, I can't believe that there's no door. And here I am getting out the easy way. And then I became paranoid, saying, he's out there watching me. He's out there watching me. So I hid in a bush and I saw these red and white lights, blue lights, like coming at the very bottom of this driveway. And I'm looking at it and I'm like, what is that? And then I realized it was a police car. And I probably could have won the Olympics that year for track. I ran so fast to it. And I must have sounded like some crazy woman, hysterical to them. And I was trying to explain to them, this is what just happened to me. You have to get me out of here. But most of all, you have to call my roommate. Because irrationally, I'm thinking, he knows where I live. He's going back to that house and he's going to kidnap my roommate and he's going to rape her as well. And so through that, we went and, of course, you're sent to a hospital and they do what's called, a rape test. We'll check on you and gather evidence. And it's really almost like you're being raped again because it's sterile.
Yeah, it's so clinical. Yeah.
Yes. And so that was what happened at the young age of 24, 25.
I am so sorry. And unfortunately for you, it wasn't just you that he did attack, right?
No, I was what they called victim number 2. There was a victim number 1 and victim number 3. And Stacy Erickson, number 1, was later found in a shallow grave. I believe she was shot in the head. And they couldn't connect the crimes together until I did a composite. And victim number 3 did a composite, 3 different cities, I believe. And then it dawned on one of the cities that these are, in fact, the same person. And then from that, because at that time, again, we had no cell phones or anything like that. However, the banks had cameras. And then through that, they were able to compile that the first victim, Stacy, was part of this as well because his face showed in a ATM machine in which he stole money from her account. Then they realized this is the same person for 3 different victims.
Wow. And did they catch the person?
They did. I remember it was after Thanksgiving. I got to fly home prior to Thanksgiving. I wasn't from Arkansas, so I was able to fly home for Thanksgiving. And then when I flew back by myself, maybe about a week or 2 after Thanksgiving, I went for 2 lineups and picked them out the second lineup. The first lineup had nothing to do with him, but the second lineup, they said a matter of seconds. I was able to say, yeah, that's him. No doubts.
And the man, his name is Marcel Williams, right?
Marcel Wayne Williams. Yes.
Yeah. And so it's just an extraordinary thing that you were able to identify him. And you talked about how it was so painful at the hospital. But once he is arrested and they are going to go to trial, you sort of are one of their star witnesses, right? You're this very bright woman. You're a law student. And I'm wondering, what happened with you and the prosecution in the months leading up to the trial? Were you offered assistance, victim services, anything like that?
Yes, I was offered services, counseling really, at that time, right off the bat, because no matter who you are, it will affect you, and it does affect you for the rest of your life. That's just something that just was not of my norm for it to ever happen. And it's, obviously something that you never want to happen again. And it was just, the flashbacks were unbelievable at the time. I received this counseling that was like a group counseling. And so I went to this group where it encompassed, I recall, like 6 or 7 other women who had been raped. And I remember sitting there listening to all of them, one by one, recount the rape that had happened to them. And when I was done and I told them what happened, they were all very sympathetic. However, I realized that when I asked questions, that all these incidents that happened to these women had happened like 10, 15, 20 years prior. And it felt like they weren't getting any quote unquote better. They were still living like it had just happened the day before. And so that, frankly, that scared me because I thought, I don't want to be here in 10 years. I don't want to be here in 2 weeks. Never mind 5, 10, 15 years that they didn't seem like they could. And then I don't want to say get over it because you don't, but be able to live a life in which this did not surround your main life, that you could live from it, that you could grow from it, that you're not stuck in that time slot of those years. So after I kind of, unquote, quit from it that day, and I said, I'm never coming back to this because this is not healthy for me. This atmosphere of hearing this over and over and over only reinforced the terror that I had gone through. And if not, made it okay for me to live in that terror day in and day out. So I left the group, never to see another counselor, given over by the state. Maybe before, I recall going to a counselor on my own, paid by myself. I didn't have health insurance that time. I was a student, so I was paying out of pocket to see some other counselors that a friend of mine had told me about and suggested. And I went and saw her. And through that, I worked out not just that, but other things too in my life that helped me as well. And I think that was the most help that I ever received, was going out by myself and seeking someone rather than the state saying, we have this support for you.
It's so interesting, right? I want to tag this as a thing and then go back to it. But, you're talking about the idea of trauma and how people process trauma, right? And how some people seem to be able to move through it and not have it define them. It becomes part of their life experience, but it's not the defining moment necessarily. And then there's some people who really do get stuck in trauma. And I don't mean stuck in any kind of judgmental way, but for whom it is a defining each and every day kind of a concept. And I'm curious to hear about some of your thoughts as we move through this conversation. But let's just sort of go back. So you had been offered this services, you left that services, but you did testify at trial against Marcel Williams, and he was convicted and he was sentenced to die. What happened after the trial?
Part of the plea agreement that we made for my case went first because it was the strongest. Again, the details, I was alive, not to, sound morose, but I was alive. And again, rape is rape. But it seemed as in my case, it was extreme as opposed to the third woman who they didn't convict him of rape in that case. And so because of that, I went first. And part of the plea agreement was that I was not to testify in Stacy's case, the death penalty case.
I see. So in your case, he actually pled guilty?
Yes.
And he was convicted and sentenced to
life.
So he was convicted and sentenced to life in your case. And then they went to trial in the Stacey Erickson murder rape case. And in that case, he was convicted and eventually a jury sentenced him to die. But you were not involved in that trial.
No, I was involved in the third person's trial as an aggravator, which means that I came in after he was found guilty and then testified as to what happened in my case. So I was an aggravator for her, but not for Stacy's case because of the plea agreement that was made.
Understood. And so you had been in school in Little Rock, and then you went home. And where was home?
I took off and I went to New Jersey, which became my home. I'm not originally from New Jersey, but my husband's from here, so I blame him. Although I love New Jersey.
I was going to say, I'm a Jersey girl.
I know.
You're going to get me to say something bad about
I know.
Jersey.
My daughter's a Jersey girl now, so I get it.
And while you were in New Jersey, you came to work as an investigator for the Office of the New Jersey Public Defender. And I'm just so curious about how that happened, given your experience with the legal system, given your experience as a crime survivor. Did you ever consider working for the prosecutor? Like, how did this all come to be?
I have never considered myself to work for the prosecuting attorney's office. And I think it's because of my upbringing. My father and mother were Peace Corps volunteers. My father became a teacher. My mother was a nurse. And so we were always helping people. That's just what we did. That's how I grew up, was to help others less fortunate than myself. I always was told that there was never anything in this world that my parents wouldn't forgive me for. There was never anything in this world that could ever cease them loving me. I don't know how many numerous times in my life that I have been so blessed to be given chance upon chance upon chance. Whether that be because of the circumstance I was in, being in a middle class and never felt poverty enter my life, whether it be my education background, to have that unbelievable opportunity to not only go through college, but to go through law school as well, which I was the only, not minority person, but the only Latina in my graduating class in Little Rock in the 90s. And so I knew from growing up, my parents are white. So in my hometown, I was the only colored person in my graduating class and probably in my high school at the time. So I knew the effects of the color of your skin as you get older and as you live in a bigger city. Even in the small city, the things that were said behind my back or in front of my face, I knew just weren't right. And so I've always been one that fair chances, regardless of the color of your skin. And so I felt as though if I worked for the prosecuting attorney's office, that wasn't necessarily so. And that I couldn't be true to how my parents raised me if I flipped the other side, so to speak. And so that's how I ended up at the public defender's office.
Right. As a champion for the underdogs.
Exactly.
Yeah, I understand. I do. And so there you were working as an investigator in New Jersey, and eventually you were contacted by the Arkansas prosecutor's office. What did they want? When did this happen?
Well, as part of the victim, you are notified and you get a phone call from what's called the Vine link, VINE. And what that does is it notifies you that the inmate has either been moved from one facility to another facility, or that they're up for parole or something, or it just notifies you as a crime victim. And so I received one of these notifications, and it amazed me that it followed me from state to state and different phone numbers to different phone numbers. That just freaked me out, first of all. And then it amazed me because it was so impersonal. And the last link I got from it was that inmate number, whatever Marcel was being transferred to the death unit in Arkansas, and that he had a clemency hearing coming up. And then I got a follow-up phone call from the prosecuting attorney's office saying, we'd love you to speak on behalf of the state and on behalf of victims to execute this man. So we'd love to bring you down and speak. And so that kind of jarred me. And I said, but what if I don't want him to die? And the response I got was, they hung up on me to the point where I was on the phone going, hello?
Really?
I guess they had never heard that response before. Now, I have to understand at this time in Arkansas.
What year are we talking about now?
He was killed in 2018.
It was in the 2000s.
Yeah,
2010.
2000s. Yeah. And so what had happened is that during this time, the state of Arkansas, the Department of Corrections, the DOC, had this supply of medicine, which was meant for people who were incarcerated who needed surgery, and they would give this medicine so they would dull their pain. But what the state of Arkansas was doing was using it. It was one of the concoctions that they would use to execute people. And they were finding out, oh, this is expiring. Well, if it's expiring, let's line up these people who are going to be executed. And basically no one cares about them. So they didn't really pick them in any order. They just picked, I want to say 8. And this was a record at that time that they were going to kill like 8 people within like, I want to say like a 2-week period. They were having like not back to back, but back to back for the purposes of execution, because you can't do one day and then the another day. I guess people need to rest. And then 2 days later, bring up another person to execute, and then 2 days later. So that's what they were doing. Was the drug was expiring. They needed to use it. Let's use them on inmates to execute them. So Marcel was one of them. And that's what was going on at the time. So it was unprecedented. No other state had ever done this before. And so there wasn't really a protocol. And so they were in like this hurry up mode, because in the state of Arkansas, you have to give someone a clemency hearing within a certain amount of time. And so they were doing that. And I'm sure the state was lining up people like, okay, let's get these victims from 20 years ago, because basically that's what it was, 20 years ago, and get them lined up so that we can get these executions off on schedule like the governor wants. And so looking back on it, it may have been that, how do we do this? Okay, we'll contact these people. Well, that one was a no. That's really strange. Move on to the next one. And it's one of these expedited things that they just frankly weren't thinking of the victims at all.
Which is kind of a strange thing because they were contacting the victims, right, to get their perspective. And yet, if the perspective didn't line up with what they needed or wanted to support the execution, they weren't so interested.
Exactly. And that had been so 180 from when I initially was testifying for them, being the quote unquote star witness, because it was a perfect textbook case that they had with me. The eyewitness was perfect. What had been done to me was so horrific that it was an easy slam dunk for them, that they were so nice, being driven around from this place to this place. And thank you so much. And you got justice, that, he's going to be put to death someday and he's convicted. Now you have what they call closure.
Before we get to closure, because I want to talk about that too. So you get this call, they basically hang up on you, but you weren't done. What did you wind up doing?
I was really mad, just because at that moment I saw what they were doing. I saw how had been treated before. And I felt as though, if this is your justice, if you're giving me justice, but now you're not giving me justice by letting me speak and telling you why I don't want this, then you know what I'm going to do? Because I've been within the public defender system, I've been an investigator, and I've spoken to an array of different witnesses. I'm calling his attorney, and I'm going to demand to say what I need to say to them, to let them know that I'm totally opposed to this. And so I reached out to friends who were still public defenders within the state of Arkansas, and specifically in the county that I had worked in, within the same county that this person had been convicted in. And I said, I need a name and I need a phone number. And they obliged me. And I called and I spoke to an investigator, because they have investigators in the unit too. And I think because they couldn't quite believe it. They're like, who is this person? They knew my name for all intents and purposes, because they were very well educated in the client's case. Only one person was working on one execution, clients to be executed. So they knew the story inside and out. They knew the case. So they knew my name, but they were just kind of surprised that someone who was a victim was willing to call them and say, I'm opposed to this, and this is why.
So what happened? Did you actually go and testify for Marcel Williams?
I did, on my own dime, because it makes sense to me that if they were to pay or have someone pay for me, it would look like that I'm being swayed, because apparently I don't have my independent thinking to figure out this is what I want to do. Or somehow I was being cajoled to do this. I was being influenced by the defendant himself, although I've never spoken to him in my whole entire life. I couldn't write to him. I couldn't give him messages or anything like that, because there's that cross examination that could be part of this clemency hearing. So they didn't want anything to hamper that. So I flew in the night before, like at midnight, woke up the next day, drove to the death unit, the Varna unit in Arkansas, 5:00 in the morning, went through the metal detector as if though you were seeing a loved one who was incarcerated. And they treated you like that too. I've been in and out of state prisons many a times. And the treatment that I got going through on that day was like so completely different than I was used to. It was intimidating. It was scary. Led to this big room, conference room of the governor's office with tons of personnel. There was newspapers. Facebook just exploded then. So you had news media everywhere, and the defense counsel and any people that they had lined up as witnesses for only him that day. So I remember it was myself and a teacher of his who taught him in elementary school. And they all went first, presented along with the video from an attorney who represented him, who said, I did wrong. I was a horrible attorney and I really screwed up this case, to his cousin who testified about him and his growing up, and live by this teacher. And then I was last, and I testified on his behalf at that time.
What did you say?
I did not plan it as in I wrote everything down. The attorney on his side wanted to ask me why I was doing this, but did not want to know, because again, it's that fine line where I could be cross-examined and have it look like, you guys colluded. But what I was able to tell them was that I'm not going to do him any harm. What I told him, quite frankly, was unplanned, and it came out. And I looked at him. The first thing I said was, Marcel Williams, I forgive you. I cried because it was so beautiful, really. Because there's this 250 plus pound man who still looks the same as he did way back then, has gained so much weight, and you could see him older, but you could still see that same kid. And he just broke down crying. And I broke down crying. Because at that time I realized that I had been holding on to this luggage of hate, and it would crop up in weird times and times that spur of the moment where something would agitate me and I would just say something or do something, and not in a physical sense, but it would just come out. And I had been living my life that way. And at this time when I felt that I need to apologize to him, or forgive him rather, that all that hatred that I had been storing up inside had just been lifted out of me. I was able to convey how we're not the same people that we were when we were so much younger. I certainly had not been the same. And that God had told me to forgive this man, that I had been forgiven so many numerous times, that if I were to follow my faith, then I needed to forgive him, or else I'd be this hypocrite of saying that I was a Christian and yet not following those same footsteps. And also realizing that the forgiveness was for me to say, to make me feel whole again, and not necessarily for Marcel to hear, although I'm sure that may have done something for him as well. But the forgiveness was for me. And in saying that, it released me, and I became such a freer person. And now when I tell people like what an angry person I was, they're like, no way, because they don't see that. But that releases you, and it brings you so much joy, and you walk with so much more happiness, and you don't carry around that everyday burden of what happened to you 20 years ago and hate it. As I always say, you can't hate the man. You can hate what happened, the event. You can hate the act, but I can't hate the man, because that's not what Jesus tells me.
So for you, I mean, it sounds like for you, this act of forgiveness was one that was born of faith. It sounds like a very deeply devoted Christian. But I'm wondering, was there also a degree of empathy that you brought to the forgiveness? Was that part of what helped you come to your place of forgiveness, empathy for him?
Yes, most definitely. When you're young, you're so selfish and you think of yourself. A lot of times that you're thinking of yourself, and even victims. As a victim, I thought of myself.
Of course. I mean, and again, you didn't invite this incident. Like this was a horrible thing that happened.
Right. As I learned during this clemency hearing, so many different things that I had never heard of. I had never been told by the defense attorney, because he never represented it, and definitely not told by the prosecuting attorney's office, was that his life was just horrible, that he had gotten so many beatings at home from his stepfather that at one point his cousin thought he was dead because he had been beaten so much. He was bleeding. He didn't move, and they thought surely he's dead. The numerous rapes that he got when he went into prison at a very young age. The poverty that he grew up with and had to learn to steal things in order to support his younger sisters. The environment at home in which his mom was an alcoholic and would basically pimp him out to males and females so that she could get money in order to support herself and her habit and her family. And so this is the environment that he grew up in. And this is what I heard on that day that kind of shaped what I eventually said, that we're all not ourselves when we're so young, and that you change. And I heard from his clergyman, his priest, say how he had taken God in, and he now believed in God. And that from himself too, that he woke up in the morning and looked at himself in the mirror and he hated who he was. And I thought, oh, do you imagine waking up, looking at yourself, hating yourself? I have never woken up and thought, I hate myself. I'm worthless, because that's not the environment that I grew up with. So I felt for him that he didn't have that same upbringing that I did and that he could have had, except for the fact that he didn't have a first chance to begin with.
Yeah. And I mean, it's so true. So many people who cause harm, so many people who commit violent crimes are often themselves survivors of violence. I mean, it's one of those horrible truths that there are all these cycles of violence that often just sort of stop when someone is put into the criminal justice system. But where was the system early when maybe things could have been done differently to help that person avoid becoming an offender in the first place? One of the things that's so remarkable about your story is that you did forgive him, and that forgiveness brought you that sense of closure that you were referring to. And obviously, victims and survivors are not monoliths. There's no one way to survive a crime. There's no good way or bad way. But I do wonder, just based on what, and I want to get into your work with Journey of Hope too, what your perspective is. Why do some people have the capacity to find closure? Why do some people have the capacity to forgive? Why do you think some people don't? And is it always rooted in religion? Why do people get to different places?
I think some of it is that old outlook. And again, this is back in the 90s that this happened, in the trial happened in the 90s. The prosecuting culture at that time was that we're going to make you feel whole again by executing someone, and that's going to make you feel so much better. But to me, that was just like, well, how can you kill someone and make me back whole? I've still been raped. Stacey Erickson's still dead. You're not going to bring her back to life. And so when the state says they're going to do that for you, and you hear these educated people who do this day in and day out, this is their profession, then you think they know better. Because it's not like I've been a victim 20 times over that I know that this isn't going to work. So you're thinking, okay, well, that's going to make me feel better. I'm going to stop having these nightmares and post-traumatic stress and everything. And then when it happens and he's put away and everything's still the same, then you're like, well, no, that wasn't your closure. So what does closure really mean? And yes, closure means different things for different people. But I found that having him sit in jail and finding out he's being executed actually traumatized me even more. That it's, wait a minute, why are you killing this guy? Killing another human being, it doesn't make you better. It doesn't give you comfort. And for me, it was that total like forgiveness